We're hoping to welcome you to our first Zoom meeting this autumn, arranged by Liberal Voice for Women. Some of you already know that we're a special interest group of Liberal Democrat members and supporters aiming to promote the interests of women and girls within our party. We're focusing in these meetings upon topics which we feel that the Liberal Democrats need to understand and discuss openly. We're not always convinced that the party's current policies are in the interests of girls and women. Tonight, I hope we're going to be able to welcome our first male speaker, Ian Dunt. His first book was brilliant, Brexit, What the Hell Happens Now? Those of you who, others people who've got copies, you may remember we crowdfunded to get copies to every MP in the House at the time. And if they haven't already got one, I think we should send a copy of this book, How to Be a Liberal, to all our Lib Dem MPs and quite a few of our peers. I'm sure they'd welcome it.
You couldn't help me, could you, Dusty? I have no idea what.
I'm going to ask you all to put your questions in the chat as we go along, and I'll call on you to ask Ian at the end. I hope that's okay. Please bear in mind that we're recording this event and we will be sharing the recording on YouTube afterwards. So please indicate when you write your questions, whether you'd like to ask it yourself or whether you prefer that I read it out to you. I'd also suggest that you put your Zoom screen on speaker view for the best view of the discussions and get ready to be entertained and enlightened. I don't think we've yet got Ian. So I'm just going to read out a couple of little excerpts from On Liberty, which was...
Hello, I'm here if you need me.
Sorry hello.
Hello, hello.
Welcome, you were able to get in eventually.
Yeah, we had a few tech difficulties, but they're over now.
Things happen. Great. Well, look, you've arrived at the perfect time because I was just about to introduce you, or rather mark time before I could introduce you. Ian Dunt was born in Guatemala, and is that right?
Actually, it's not. I know I need to correct Wikipedia because I know that's where people get it from. I was born in England, but I'm half Guatemalan. Yeah. Okay.
And you grew up in Chile and England, Winchester and Southampton. Studied philosophy at London, then international relations at Warwick, and journalism and media law at the London School of Journalism. Is that right? Because again, that's Wikipedia.
That's all true. It's quite. I've never heard anyone bring up all of these credentials yet.
Well, you know, it's we like to have philosophers on our program here, and also it's unusual but not surprising that you studied international relations. Ever likely you were so gobstruck by the whole Brexit debacle. And you worked for Yahoo, and then you became the political editor at the Erotic Review. And is that right?
Yeah, among other things, yeah.
And is now editor of politics.co.uk. I gather you're also in the I paper from time to time. And he has one podcast which used to be Romaniacs and is now, oh God, what now? And a non-Brexit political podcast called The Bunker. Now, your book, this fabulous book, is wonderfully accessible. And to many of us who aren't historians of liberal democracy, and it starts with the threat of nationalism and quickly sets up in opposition to it the single most radical political programme in the history of humankind, liberalism. Now, we're going to focus, I think, not on the whole book, but I understand that you want to focus upon Harriet Taylor Mill and John Stuart Mill. But I'm just going to have a little bit of an introductory sentence or two. You say it's a unit of analysis, the freedom of the individual which cannot be used to oppress. And we see over the chronicle you detail the increasing demand for freedom, whether against the state or the rest of society. And you've woven in the stories of Descartes, Milton, Rainsborough, the Levellers, Benjamin Constant and Madame de Staël, Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations, and then you come to the collaboration and the love story of Harriet and John. Now, shall I ask you questions or shall I just let you fly?
Oh no, ask me what. No, yeah, please ask me questions.
Well, okay, she's been described, as you tell us, as a type of airhead flirt, a scheming seductress, both useless and powerfully manipulative, frigid, masochistic, imperious, paranoid, an unpleasant woman, likened to Salome in that John Stuart Mill was bewitched. What is your impression of Harriet Taylor Mill?
Well, it won't surprise you to learn that it doesn't bear any resemblance to the things that have been said about her. These libels started really, I mean, even really when she was alive, but certainly took on a new force once she died, and have continued really for the entirety of the period since then until now. Historians of, especially people writing about John Stuart Mill, tend to sort of use her as this laundry device where any of the things he said that they don't agree with, and John Stuart Mill is quite an eccentric thinker, there's going to be something that anyone would disagree with, would blame her for him taking on those views and sort of credit him with everything that went right and ignore her completely. I mean, the thing is to sort of break down her personality and the politics. The personality bears no connection to the way that she's described. She's very hard to get to know. We have very little information to work off. We have what John Stuart Mill said and her friends and other people that knew them said about her. And we also have their letters, but the letters are really cut down. So we have about 300 letters from Harriet. To give you an impression of how few that is, if you take the period sort of December 1853 to April 1854, we have 38 letters from John Stuart Mill in that period to her. We have just one from Harriet to John. Now, that's not because she was writing to him less than he was writing to her. It was because after she died, the letters were destroyed. We're never going to have more information on that front unless we get super lucky and a treasure trove pops up. So there's relatively little evidence there. What we have a lot of the time are these sort of scraps of paper where she wrote her thoughts. And these thoughts were not written with sort of, a fountain pen in the quiet of the nighttime. They were mostly written all the way around the page, up the sides, upside down. They seem to be written a lot when she was in transport, when she was sort of being moved from one place to another. Lots of the time, they're conversations that she's having with someone, typically either her daughter or John Stuart Mill, when she's sort of at a show or she's at a dinner party, and you can just see one side of the conversation. It's essentially like seeing one side of a WhatsApp or a text conversation. And what comes across from her is this kind of incredibly vivacious, witty, wry, cutting. I mean, she can absolutely savage anyone when she wants to. Very, very thoughtful, rebellious personality. That's the kind of human that we see when we actually look at the things that she wrote and the things that those who knew her wrote about her.
I see. So none of these slurs against her have a lot of substance to them.
Well, it's impossible to see where, in terms of her character, it's impossible to see where they come from. I mean, I've read all of the letters. I've read everything there is to read about the stuff that she communicated to the world. Again, that's not hard to do. We've got it in one collected edition. And, there is no basis upon which you could possibly come to this conclusion on the basis of the evidence that we have. So then you start looking at the politics. What we get from the politics, quite distinctly from what anyone describes, is one of the chief architects of modern liberalism. It would be wrong to put it any lower than that on the basis of the evidence we have. So let me start setting out the evidence for why that might be the case, if that's all right. We know that they met in 1830, John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor. They met at a dinner party. Now, at that point, she's married to John Taylor. She's got 2 children. She's got one more on the way. John Stuart Mill is this kind of semi-broken child experiment, who was supposed to be turned into this utilitarian, in his words, dry, hard logic machine by his father. They did create a hard logic machine. They also created a sort of emotionally broken individual who was trying to discover the ability to feel things. They meet at this party. Now, we know that within 12 months, in 1831, Elizabeth Flower, one of her friends, reads an article in a magazine. Now, this is the period when you didn't have a byline in a magazine, so you wouldn't know who the author was of a piece. And the note that she writes to Harriet is, did you or John write it? So within a year, for those who were very close to them, they were considered essentially intellectually interchangeable. And they themselves then formed what John Stuart Mill called a joint production. Okay? Now, John Stuart Mill, They eventually got married much, much later. John Stuart Mill profoundly loved his wife. I mean, he loved his wife in a way. It's arguable that no man has loved his wife more than John Stuart Mill loved his wife. He was absolutely besotted with her. So it's been suggested, oh, well, he exaggerated her benefits. He exaggerated her contribution to his writing. Actually, what the argument against that is, you look at what John Stuart Mill says about each of his works. He's actually very fastidious about saying what she contributed to and what she didn't. So let me read you sort of a few quotes where he goes into it. I mean, his early work on formal logic and symbolic logic, he says that she contributed very, very little to it. We know that that's true. I mean, she said that you can summarize her assessment of that work was simply 3 words: so very dry. She had almost no interest in the work he did on logic. On political economy, he said, you know, that it was quite minute what she contributed to. There's a little bit on class. In reality, I think when you look at what Harriet contributed to his work on political economy, it wasn't particularly strong. It was mostly on sort of workers' collectives, and it's fairly irrelevant to the really significant economic work that John Stuart Mill did. On the work on feminism, on early feminism, that is a joint production that came from them both, and that is expressed by them. This is what John Stuart Mill said. He said the subjection of women, one of the earliest British feminist texts, came from, quote, the fund of thought which had been made common to us both. On liberty is the closest thing that liberalism has to a Bible. He said, the liberty was more directly and literally our joint production than anything else which bears my name. There was not a sentence of it that was not several times gone through by us together, turned over in many ways, and carefully weeded of any faults, either in thought or expression, that we detected in it. The conjunction of her mind with mine has rendered it a kind of philosophical textbook of a single truth. We have notes of them working together. Some of these notes show sentences that are begun in his handwriting and finished in hers. Very often what you find is that she will be doing the editing function. She relies on him because they sort of conclude that he's the better writer. I'm not in any way certain that that's true, by the way. When you look at their notes, I find both of them are very elegant with their writing. Very often you'll find one of them, the sentences finished by her in pencil, and he will then put them in pen when he agrees with the edit, or he will then try and change something and they have a dialogue as to how they write. They were extremely explicit about the fact that this is a joint partnership. When you read their letters to each other, they talk about themselves in the collective. So for instance, John Stuart Mill says, he's talking about the political economy book. This is encouraging, since if that sells, I should think anything we put our name to would sell. Later on, he says, we must cram into it as much as possible of what we wish not to leave unsaid. John Taylor, her own husband, who was basically the poor man, spent 20 years with her essentially having a separate marriage to John Stuart Mill, would talk constantly of both authors. Now, this is not something he was happy to admit. This was something that caused him deep distress. He would talk of both authors. And in her own notes from the 1830s, about 2 decades before Liberty was published, we find many of the basic ideas, including the harm principle, probably the most important mechanism in modern liberalism, and of the role of eccentricity as one of the sort of really important functional elements by which liberal society flourishes. So you look at the evidence and you find that she is the mother of liberalism, and all of those quotes, those diatribes against her, are an attack not on the reality of her personality or her character, but really an attempt to erase her from the historical record.
And they certainly seem to have succeeded. It's only now that we're finding out about her.
No, well, she's been around. I would love to say that was true, and this is all down to me, but it isn't. She's been around. One of the people who oddly probably did most to help us learn about her was Friedrich Hayek, the right-wing neoliberal, who was himself guilty, really, of some of the sort of the smears against her character. He did it all the time. Because, of course, John Stuart Mill had very many left-wing economic principles. In fact, you could argue that he established sort of radical or egalitarian or social democratic liberalism. So Hayek was one of those people who would say, oh, but that, you know, when he started writing about the state interfering in the market, that was all Harriet. You know, she lured him over to this sort of socialist thought, which we can safely ignore. However, Hayek managed to secure many of these letters. If it wasn't for Hayek, we wouldn't have them. So it's always been there. But every time it comes up, with almost all of Mill's biographers, you see an attempt to push down her reputation, to come up with justifications for why what they themselves said about the writing and the evidence we have ourselves about it was no longer correct. So I think it's been a long time that people have pushed back against it. But the debate has always sort of been live, really, even from the moment that they were alive themselves.
I see. He was quite clear about their working relationship, wasn't he? I mean, he quoted on page 146 about what does it matter who actually did the writing, in this wide sense, not only during the years of our married life, but during many of the years of confidential friendship which preceded, all my published writings were as much her work as mine.
Yes, although I mean, you can't always trust what they wrote about their own relationship. And when what he calls confidential friendship was really stretching the boundaries of that phrase as much as it could possibly go. They were by that point essentially man and wife. She just happened to still be with her previous husband.
And how did she and John, Harriet Taylor Mill and John, manage to override or stare out the gossip mill, the clack of tongues that you described?
Yeah, well, they didn't really. The clack of tongues is this beautiful phrase, and I think it summarizes one of the social impacts that they felt. It's a phrase by Thomas Carlyle. Thomas Carlyle, sort of a good friend of theirs until he wasn't, arguably one of the forerunners of fascism, you could say. I think it's always a bit unfair when people smear him with that. He'd almost certainly been killed by the Nazis if he was around when they came to power. But his great man sort of theory of history played into the fascist attempt to create some kind of intellectual underpinning to their theory. He said, he was one of the first really to smear her character. She seduced him, he's head over heels in love, they're suffering the clack of tongues, this rumor mill around London. And that kicked off very early on. Eventually, very early in their relationship, it prompted her husband to say, look, you've got to write to him and just say, you're cutting this off. And she does. She writes him a letter, now lost to us, but you can tell the letter was there. Which says, I'm going to cut this off. John Stuart Mill writes back to a very beautiful letter. I have a bit of it here, where he says he accepts the fact that she's breaking up with him, and he puts some rose petals in the envelope and says, at whatever time, in whatever place that may be so, she will find me always the same as I have been, as I am still. Which is one of those pieces of writing that you're like, I mean, if that doesn't work, nothing's going to work. And of course it does work. The relationship starts up again. But she eventually has enough, and she decides she's going to go to Paris, and she's going to make a final decision on which man she's going to stay with. And in a very Victorian, gentlemanly way, without seemingly holding any sort of ill thoughts towards one another, the men visit one after the other to sort of, try and convince her to stay with them. She comes back to London, and Harriet decides she's not going to change anything. She's going to stay in her marriage. Her husband was, again in Carlyle's phrase, an innocent, dull, good man. He wasn't a bad guy. She doesn't really want to hurt him. She doesn't want to humiliate him in public. And also, of course, according to Victorian rules, she would lose contact with her children. She has no ownership over any money or family. So she decides to keep that arrangement. But what she proposes to both is that John Stuart Mill would then function as the intimate part of the marriage. They would essentially create a tripartite marriage arrangement. The public face with her current husband, John Stuart Mill, in the latter. And that works for years and years and years. It's really in that scenario that most of their writing partnership operates. And by the way, not only does it work, but I have to say it's a tremendously successful relationship. Sort of nearly 2 decades into their relationship, this is what she's writing to him. When I think that I shall not hold your hand until Tuesday, the time is so long and my hand is so useless. And then later she writes in that same letter, but then through every moment in my life, you are my one sole interest and object, and I would at any instance give up all, were it 10,000 times as much, rather than have the chance of one iota of diminution of your love. Now that situation continues until her husband dies. And really that's this real moment of crisis for the two of them. She goes back to the husband, she stays there during his dying days, which goes on for a long time and are very painful and traumatic for her. And she suddenly feels the sort of falsity of the social arrangement that she has set up. One that they hadn't really had to face. I mean, they mostly moved to Blackheath, they stopped seeing people, they essentially closed their doors to society, to intellectual society, to high society. And suddenly she has to face it. They have a couple of arguments during that period where it really feels like that's going to be the end of their relationship. And then not long after her husband dies, she writes a letter to John Stuart Mill. And she says, Again, it's interesting that it's still about the clack of tongues. I want your opinion about coming to the funeral next Wednesday. The grounds of all I wish done at this time are twofold: what the world thinks most respectful to him and what he would have wished. My first impression about your coming was a feeling of better not, grounded on the sort of distance which has of late existed. But now, on much consideration, it seems to me that coming is certainly thought a mark of respect, is it not? Then again, the public in some degree have heard or are sure to hear of our intimacy. Now that continues for a while, and then there's just a letter where she says to him, we must speak. I have too much to think about now. And that begins the process. There's a respectful gap of, I think, 18 months or so. And that begins the process by which they eventually finally get married, sort of decades after they first met.
I see. As that's a much longer gap than I had imagined that there had been. But how did Harriet manage to succeed in her remarkable decision to set up this arrangement that served them quite well? And how did she keep her husband, John Taylor, complacent, if you will?
Yes, it's a really good question. We only have two instances really of him losing his rag about the arrangements. The first one is that first moment I mentioned very, very early on, where he's like, you must stop speaking to this man. The second is, tellingly enough, when they tried to have a sort of co-byline for one of the books that's published, where they tried to say, this is the two of us writing this book together. And then he really does lose his mind. He gets terribly upset about the whole thing. And instead, what they do is they print off little sort of templates that say, with both authors' name, and they put them in copies of the book that they hand to their friends. The rest of the time, he's relaxed about it. Now, there's a lot of theories that swirl around about this. One theory is just that he was Carlyle's innocent, dull, good man, and just wasn't that fussed. That he was just scared of losing her. Some people say, and this is one of those theories that you have to propose a lot of things for which we do not have evidence. That he had syphilis, that he got syphilis from a prostitute. This is obviously very common back in the day. He passed it on to her. She has a lot of medical conditions through her life, and in fact, her early death is a symptom of that. And it's possible that she got syphilis from her husband, and this made him. Maybe there's absolutely no basis upon the evidence that we have to come to this conclusion. So you go into this, you're really positing an awful lot that doesn't necessarily need to be here. So the honest answer is you don't know. It is just about possible that she was an extremely convincing individual, and that's certainly the evidence of what we see in her writing.
And obviously, both these men were really taken with her.
Oh yeah, you can't. I mean what I said. I've not come across an instance of someone who loves their wife more than John Stuart Mill loved his wife. We have to have. To give that some context. This is a man who, like I say, was raised to be this cold hard logic machine. He said of his education. I thus was raised in the absence of love and in the presence of fear. This was a brutalizing thing. He was denied any opportunity to play with other boys, to listen to music, to listen to any kind of arts, to play games of any sort. It left him so physically incapable that he really couldn't even do up a tie. Anything that involved using his hands, he was incapable of doing. And when he reached his 20s, in a way that would, I think, surprise no one, he had a complete emotional breakdown and became, deeply suicidal, was planning on committing suicide. What brought him back to life was predominantly poetry, mostly Wordsworth, where he had a sense of being able to feel things again. But it's only when he meets her that really you get that sense that he's this complete human being. So for the outside, for the letters, for the articles that he's writing, it's just this remorseless machine gun of rational argument. With her, you get a taste by the way that I'm describing his letters. It is just this constant sense of feeling and yearning and need and love. So yes, it's partly just that he loved her a lot. I suspect it's also partly that she was a life raft to someone who'd had a brutalizing, frankly, emotionally abusive childhood, that there was someone there he could express his feelings to, that he could access that part of himself with.
It sounds like, excuse me, it sounds as though John Stuart Mill's father was the absolute model of the paterfamilias that we know of in the Victorian times, and he was the opposite. He was determined not to assert these legal rights he would have had as a husband over Harriet, and which I suppose his father had exerted over his mother.
Yeah, what's hard to tell about that is John Stuart Mill, in a fascinating way, almost never mentions his mother. Even in the autobiography, it's full of this, how terrible his father is. He just doesn't mention the mother at all. So you really never get a sense of what she's like from any of his writings. Certainly, you're right. When it comes to the marriage, in fact, it's actually worth having what John Stuart Mill said at the marriage ceremony. It's not romantic, but it is powerfully, politically sort of relevant and gives an indication of his character. This is what he said at his marriage ceremony. I, having no means of legally divesting myself of these odious powers, feel it my duty to put on record a formal protest against the existing law of marriage, insofar as conferring such powers, and a solemn promise never in any case or under any circumstances to use them. I declare it to be my will and intention, and the condition of the engagement between us, that she retains in all respects whatsoever the same absolute freedom of action and freedom of disposal of herself and of all that does or may at any time belong to her, as if no such marriage had taken place. Now, I mean, it does have a sort of beauty to it. It is not romantic beauty, although in a sense it is. And this was the product, really, of what they did for British feminism. And not just feminism, really. It was their work together, that joint fund of thought, showed liberalism. If you are going to talk about the freedom of the individual, let's not just talk about free speech and voting rights, because that's not where it ends. Why is there one class of human beings in this society whom are denied any of the rights that we speak about when we talk about individual rights under liberalism? So they took the first time, I think, for liberalism, they took a piercing look at what was being done to women in their society. And what they concluded was that women were reduced to biology, that essentially the act of sex had been allowed to define what a woman was. In preparation for marriage, it was of the utmost importance in Victorian period that she had never had sex. And once she had had sex, it was of the utmost importance that it was only done for procreation and that she was defined as a mother and nothing else at all. And this was their brutalizing attack, really, on the patriarchy, really the beginning of coherent, sophisticated sort of feminist thought, I would argue, in the Victorian period, of really sort of really very mature thought. But it was also extremely radical. Let me read you what they wrote about the character of women in these books. They wrote, meekness, submissiveness, and resignation of all individual will into the hands of a man represent an essential part of sexual attractiveness. What is now called the nature of women is an eminently artificial thing, the result of forced repression in some directions, unnatural stimulation in others. It may be asserted without scruple that no other class of dependents have had their character so entirely distorted from its natural proportions by their relation with their masters. I consider for a moment the radicalism of that, because it's not just saying, we need to change the laws, so women can keep property or so women can vote. Their argument was that the oppression of women was so severe and had lasted for so long that the entirety of the personality that was imposed on them from childhood, from a very early age, was to create a sense of an unliberal, someone who could not have the capacity for autonomy, could not have the capacity for freedom of choice. It was essentially dictated in their personality and their psychology by the demands of the sort of slave-owning class who had taken them as property. Now, to put that out, in that, I think even now that is a radical idea. To put that out in the middle of the Victorian period, I just think is an astonishing feat of intellectual and moral accomplishment.
The breadth of vision as well is quite confounding, isn't it?
Yeah, yes, exactly. And let's not forget, by the way, that this relationship then partly, is a huge contributory factor in securing women the vote. When after Harriet Taylor dies, John Stuart Mill becomes an MP. Now he is in 1867, I think it is, in the 1867.
Yes. In your book.
So he's terrible at it. He's very, very bad as an MP. He has Walter Bagehot, the sort of Victorian journalist, said, it's a beautiful quote. I can't quite remember it. It's an extremely elitist quote, but that doesn't mean it's not true. And it is very funny, I think. He said, what did the Westminster electors know of Mr. Mill? What fraction of his mind could be imagined by any percentage of their mind? It's tremendously elitist. But it's also, in this case, he was just unable to function in any kind of party political way. He was unable to function in the way that the Commons required of him. However, for one Reform Act, he put down an amendment. It's a very simple amendment that essentially changed the word men to person. It was the first time that women's suffrage had been put down, had been debated in the Commons. It got a respectable number of votes. It didn't pass. It wasn't meant to pass. It was meant to be the springboard for the campaign to secure women the vote. Now, decades and decades later, in 1920s, Millicent Fawcett, who had started that campaign with John Stuart Mill, the two of them in partnership, when she watched the vote for women to take the vote in the Commons, in the public gallery, she then left and with a delegation of women walked over to John Stuart Mill's statue on Embankment and paid tribute. Now that was the end really of that process that began with Harriet Taylor and John Stuart Mill and their joint fund of thought. Now it is a joint fund, and it's absolutely true that John Stuart Mill was a feminist before he met Harriet. He always had been from the very early days. When he was once walking through London, he saw a sort of an aborted embryo on the street and spent that evening putting up signs talking about contraceptives for women, and was in fact arrested and thrown in a jail cell overnight. If anyone wants to write a play about the night that John Stuart Mill spent in jail, I would very much be up for watching that. So he was a feminist, but undoubtedly, and even her most critical sort of, even her worst critics, I think, would accept this. She was a powerful influence, making him more feminist, making him sort of dedicate himself to that idea, contributing to the writing that they had. Under that, really, and for several works and for several articles, you have to say that she actually had the dominant role in a lot of that writing. So again, even when you get past the ideas, simply on the basis of political change in this country, she has an absolutely pivotal role, which for years now hasn't been properly recognised.
I suppose from that point of view, he had the philosophical understanding of it, but she had the lived experience, as you say later.
Yes, very good modern phrase. Exactly.
Yes.
She had the lived experience of it. She knew when she came back from Paris that day that if she was to leave her husband, she had no rights to see her children. She had no rights over any of the property. I mean, this was not something that was an abstract issue for her. Her sister, it's quite hard to tell from the letters, but I think you have to be quite imaginative to escape the interpretation that her sister was married to a wife beater. There's lots of passages where the sister says, my face was so sort of like blackened from crying that I was unable to go to the event. And you think, well, it could be crying, but it comes up so often that you think it sounds like you had bruises on your face. So certainly there seems that even in the broader sense of her life that she had some experience of what this entailed.
And Helen Lewis came and spoke to us earlier this year, and she wrote in her book about difficult women about Caroline Norton, who, of course, had made great strides in freeing women from that obligation. I don't know if you remember that part of it, but that was, I think, just before Harriet Taylor was able to leave her husband, or decided she might have a go at that in France. But I think you're quite right that you would be risking your whole relationship with the children, and you invest so much in the children's lives that you don't want to do that, do you? You don't want to risk that. I get that. You wrote about something in the subjection of women. You mention it arose simply from the fact that from the very earliest twilight of human society, every woman, owing to the value attached to her by men, combined with her inferiority and muscular strength, was found in a state of bondage to some man. That's quite a piece of writing, that, isn't it? Even now,
Yes,
even
yes. I mean, I should add, that's not me. That was their writing.
indeed, absolutely. But
I wish I'd written.
Every page there's something you want to. Oh, it's like a jewel, isn't it? You want to keep that for later.
Their whole, I mean, I would say, especially subjection of women, that for anyone who's going into sort of anything to do with politics, who's interested in the art of argument, regardless of their interest in these issues, should read that book. It is remorseless, just absolutely remorseless. And it takes with it this seriousness of conviction that just delivers the argument in a way that can barely be countered. Their view of human history, which I think is a very convincing one, is essentially that at the beginning, before society, there was simply force. The hard man takes what he wants, or the hard man loses to a group of even more hard men, and on we go. And that when law came, it was not a victory over force. It was simply the consolidation of force into a way that could then be enforceable by the state. And that women were then considered property on that basis. So the history of liberalism, which started, agitating against slavery, agitating against feudalism, had really just missed this entire class, a slave class, that had been completely overlooked. But it wasn't just philosophy that they did. They also did campaigning journalism. So over and over again, when they found that women who'd been killed by a male partner, or female servants that had been killed by a male partner, or young girls that had been killed by a violent father, they pursued them and pursued them and pursued them in campaigning journalism. Sometimes, I don't know how people would feel about this now. When there was an innocent verdict, they called them acquitted murderers, and encourage their readers to continue to treat them as murderers. So it wasn't just philosophy, it was also campaigning journalism. And even that journalism, written in a very different way, was extremely powerful, extremely persuasive, and absolutely driven by this sense of perpetual moral outrage. It's also worth saying, by the way, that John Stuart Mill it was probably the most damaging thing that happened to his reputation. I mean, now it's held up as one of the most impressive of his accomplishments. Certainly for him, the mockery that he experienced in the pages of the satirical press and the pages of the Commons was constant. I mean, absolute perpetual mockery of his reputation, of his standing. And of course, one of the great liberal qualities is the ability to stand up and say what you believe in, regardless of the social ostracization or the social insults that will come your way. And I think by virtue of that, they demonstrated, the degree of commitment that is involved in that decision.
And I think they were talking about having an annual tally, really, a count up of all the women murdered and beaten by their husbands. And in fact, we get that now, don't we? We get Jess Phillips standing up using the femicide count of Karen Engler to give this list of all the women who have died at the hands of their partners. And this is, 150 years after the period we're talking about, when John Stuart Mill, as you say, was campaigning for just such a thing. Yeah, that's really something, isn't it? Really something. You talk about the harm principle. I don't know whether it's time for us to move on to this magnificent opus on liberty, but do you want to tell us a little bit about, or a lot, about On Liberty and how they combined to produce it?
Yeah, it's a sad book in a way, because it's really the final testament to their love affair. They start writing it quite late in her life. They're the same age. He was only born a year before her, but she was very unwell, and they were scoping out sort of retirement homes. And she died quite suddenly, in fact, in a hotel room overseas. And John Stuart Mill spent one day and one night alone with her body in the room. He wrote, I mean, we can't really begin to compute the degree of loss that he experienced at that moment. This is the woman that had provided him with the capacity to feel beyond anything else. He said in his autobiography, for 7.5 years, that privilege was mine, for 7.5 years only. That was how long they were married. And their relationship had gone on longer, but for their marriage, that was all they got. Just before that, they had started working on Liberty together. It's the only book he never revised or touched in any way that he wrote. And the reason he didn't touch it was because for him, it was this testament of the two of them. As he said, the conjunction of her mind with mine, a single truth. And it was, by distance, I think, the most important book of liberalism that's ever been published. Actually, you know what? If we've got a second, can I read the dedication that he puts to her at the beginning of
Yes, I wish you would. Yeah.
Oh, thanks. That's really, it's very much worth reading out, because I think it's probably the most beautiful dedication that I'm aware of in any book, whether literary or otherwise. He said, "To the beloved and deplored memory of her who was the inspirer and in part the author of all that is best in my writings, the friend and wife, whose exalted sense of truth and right was my strongest excitement, and whose approbation was my chief reward, I dedicate this volume. Like all that I have written for many years, it belongs as much to her as to me, but the work as it stands has had, in a very insufficient degree, the inestimable advantage of her revision, some of the most important portions having been reserved for a more careful re-examination, which they are now never destined to receive. Were I but capable of interpreting to the world one half the great thoughts and noble feelings which are buried in her grave, I should be the medium of a greater benefit to it than is ever likely to arise from anything that I can write, unprompted and unassisted by her all but unrivaled wisdom. And I think, to be honest, that gave a cap and a proper description of her qualities, which centuries of slander and abuse from critics would not be able to wipe away.
Indeed.
What happens in On Liberty, I think, is that the experience they had as this very strange couple in this strange tripartite marriage, and of course of their own really quite eccentric individual characters, is processed into political reality. And there are very many ways that happens. The harm principle is a chief mechanism, absolutely. And there's an argument for free speech in there that I think is the most powerful argument that exists for free speech. And I'm happy to go into those. But for me personally, what really matters in what they did in On Liberty is the celebration of the concept of autonomy. And that is without parallel to me in liberal thought. It is the idea of thinking for yourself, of acting for yourself, of not allowing your family or your society or your class or your religion or your race or anything else to dictate to you the manner in which you should be. That there should be a deep internal life within us, a place of quiet where we can establish that we do things because we truly believe in them, because we have processed them ourselves, rather than because of the strength of convention. And you can feel when they write about it, that judgment, that social judgment that was pushing down on their relationship. And they put it in very strong terms. I mean, again, this is beautiful writing. They write, this is from On Liberty, our merely social intolerance kills no one, roots out no opinions, but induces men to disguise them or to abstain from any active effort for their diffusion. The price paid for this sort of intellectual pacification is the sacrifice of the entire moral courage of the human mind. Later they write, whatever crushes individuality is despotism, by whatever name it may be called. And then finally, in this age, the mere example of nonconformity, the mere refusal to bend the knee to custom is itself a service. Precisely because the tyranny of opinion is such as to make eccentricity a reproach, it is desirable, in order to break through that tyranny, that people should be eccentric.
That's a wonderful.
It's so beautiful. And you start to see really what On Liberty is. I mean, On Liberty is not just a work of political philosophy. On Liberty is a self-help guide. It is a guide to living a liberal life, to having the capacity to think for yourself, to stand up against convention. And that, I would suggest, is an immediate byproduct of the scenarios and situations in which their relationship played out.
Yeah, there's so much in On Liberty. In fact, I think at a previous talk you gave, you talked about having to read it. You've got to, and I've got to read it all now. I've read bits of it, but I haven't read the whole thing. And I think I'm going to have a good go at it. I've actually got the Oxford edition, which has got a lovely picture on the front anyway, and it's got on the subjection of women in that as well.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so, you know, I think it's going to keep me busy. But tell us more about this work that she helped to write but didn't live to revise.
So the biggest contribution it has is the harm principle. And she first expresses the harm principle in 1831, so over 2 decades before the book is published. In her notes, these small scribbled down notes where she's traveling somewhere, and she says, you know, really the only basis upon which you're entitled to interfere with someone is if you were trying to prevent them interfering with the happiness of others. At that point, she's still using the word happiness. You can see the kind of utilitarian origins of this theory. By the time we get to On Liberty, that has changed to the concept of harm. That there is only one scenario in which you may interfere with the freedom of others, and that is to prevent harm to others. So the first thing that you end up asking is, what does harm mean? And they will answer, you can't provide an answer to this question. Now, it's perfectly obvious that almost everything we do has the capacity to harm someone else. If I decide that I only want to eat sweets for the rest of my life, that's my personal choice. But it would invariably involve, unless I'm very, very lucky, I could try and test it out, having a very short lifespan, taking up resources on the NHS, upsetting my family, of course. They say that it's not something that you can dictate. What you can do is just provide guidance for how you might come to conclusions about this. So we take something like free speech, harm to others. Their standard for harm to others is very high. They say if you were to have grain protests about the price of grain, violent and outside the house of someone who sells bread, then you can intervene. Then you might be able to stop the protest, stop the free speech. But notice how high that test is. It's not just in the abstract. If someone says we should murder the person that is bread, it's in the context of a violent protest outside of the house. So they would want a very high barrier to that kind of thing. On the sale of poisons, they say, you know, some people need poisons for other mechanisms. So we would suggest that you have a sort of setup where you have to write down your name and address and where you bought it, so that if someone tries to murder someone with this stuff, we can track them down. You lose a bit of freedom by having to fill out the form, but we also protect people against murder. So it's a case-by-case assessment. And of course it is, because liberalism is a case-by-case philosophy. It is dependent on about how you think rather than the conclusions that you come to. It is not about stone tablets passed down from on high. But that mechanism, I find in my own life, is powerfully effective. It's powerfully effective not in a way that necessarily gives you an answer, but that trains you in the manner to think about things. And I mean things as diverse as, you know, from smoking bans to coronavirus legislation to any number of issues. Most issues that are of interest in politics, I think, can be assessed by the harm principle, including, by the way, environmental issues. I think you can look at environmental issues and assess them using the harm principle. The only ones I come across that really don't respond to the harm principle are animal rights issues, where the animal is not considered an individual, and you probably need a different category for that. But generally speaking, you can use it almost everywhere, and that mechanism originates with them. I mean, it has heritage, which really goes all the way back to the English Civil War, arguably, and I think Richard Overton in the Civil War. But nevertheless, the mechanism, the pure, clean mechanism that can be used in application across the political spectrum, that really originates with them in anonymity.
And that sense that you're balancing people's rights and privileges to ensure that everybody else gets their fair share of rights, that's still with us now, isn't it? And still keeps us going, mostly.
Yeah, it does. I mean, you know, and it leads to some tremendously complex debates. So let me take, for instance, the right to live a life of unfreedom. Now, for them, they look at that mostly with sort of Mormon wives, which obviously they found the sort of disgraceful, you know, having polygamy and, you know, lots of women without any rights. But it upsets them greatly, as does, you know, sort of sex work. But again, they come to the same conclusion. They say, well, you have to be allowed to do this in the same way that someone must be allowed to become a soldier or a monk, you know, to give up certain freedoms. So they say what is really required of someone who wants to live a life where they are unequal and unfree is entry and exit checks. They have to enter the relationship or the arrangement with a full cognizance of what it is that they're going into and of sound mind. They have to do it autonomously. And at any moment, they must be able to leave that relationship. Now, you look at modern liberal theory, especially when you look at sort of multiculturalism, something like Kim Limbecker, a variety of really important, interesting thinkers, really from the 1990s in liberal theory, looking primarily at sort of what happens within sort of groups, typically religious groups, but not always exclusively religious groups, that control the rights of women. And again, you see liberal debate framed entirely around the exit and the entry check. You know, to what extent can you give up your freedoms? And that very, very sophisticated, very modern kind of liberal theory has its roots, its heritage right there in On Liberty.
Yeah. This objecting to something and then allowing it. It wasn't a defect in the system, you say. It was the peak of liberal action.
Yes, I find this tremendously beautiful as well, because we feel it all the time. I mean, there are, if you are trying to think truly as a liberal, you will find that there are many things that you come across and your first instinct is, well, I want that to stop. I want this to end. And in fact, no, you are a liberal. And therefore, it is, as long as everyone has their own consent and everyone has entered into it freely and can exit at any time, it is your duty as a liberal to facilitate them to make those decisions and also to make sure that they can leave it. So that feeling that feels very unnatural of hating something and yet not being able to want to ban it feels counterintuitive. In fact, it is just the peak level operation of liberal consciousness. the thing where you have the two-step, where you push back against your emotional instinct, where you stand in a better place than those who can only respond instinctively to what their emotions first tell them. Anyone who spends an hour on social media will know that we live in a society where people were very good at expressing their instinctive first emotion to something. To be able to stand back from that against your own interests, against your own emotions, and to provide that people have full autonomy regardless of your views. Yeah, that is absolutely the peak of liberal performance.
Absolutely. Can you explain how Harriet and John arrived at this notion of the harm principle? Was it something that's, as you said, was to do with Overton during the Civil War period, or is it something that developed later?
I think they mostly get it from utilitarianism.
Right.
I think, which is very odd, because I mean, he was, John Stuart Mill was brought up to be a utilitarian. I mentioned happiness before in Harriet's writing, so you can see it having an influence on her. And utilitarianism, is the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number, and that should be the moral dictator that sort of establishes the manner in which you proceed. Now, it's, I don't think, a very good theory. There is there's a kind of glib counter to it, which focuses on, the thought experiment of you're in the boat with your mother and a doctor, a scientist who can cure cancer. The boat capsizes, and, who should you save? And the strict utilitarian view is you should save the scientist because the greatest good can come to the world. And there was a philosopher later on who responded to this thought experiment by saying, if you didn't think you should save your mother, you've just had one thought too many. Which I think is a very glib takedown, but also I think quite a charismatic and funny one. What utilitarianism did provide, I think, was a real sense of egalitarianism to the liberal project. So the couple really moved away from it. And yet, of course, if you think the greatest good for the greatest number, you are dealing with a fundamentally egalitarian creed. You're dealing with each instance of a person being of the same moral worth as another, as a unit. Fairly crude moral units, but nevertheless, equal moral units. And once you start shifting from utilitarianism to liberalism, I think you find yourself in the kind of place where you can easily come up with the harm principle, where it makes a lot of sense as part of that journey. So I think probably the biggest influence was that. In terms of the longer heritage, from the moment that Richard Overton, one of the levellers fighting against the king and against the Presbyterians in Parliament in the 1640s, was put in the jail cell and wrote that each man has his own liberty as property, and that liberty extends up until the point where it affects another man's liberty, you start to see the start of the formulation. When you look at the rights of man during the French Revolution, you see a very similar formulation. So that fundamental idea of what is the end point of liberty, the point at which it affects the liberty of others, obviously has a very, very long heritage. But I think the combination of utilitarianism and very, very sophisticated political thought from Harriet and John were what sort of hardened it into the harm principle.
Yes. And then they discussed this question of doubt. And the idea that you think, what you think, but you have to think to yourself, am I on the wrong side of history? Or, am I right to think this? Or should I be in step with everybody else? Or should I be eccentric, as they said?
Right, yeah. Well, in a way, the history of liberalism is the history of doubt. It starts with Descartes weaponizing doubt against, sort of epistemological, really sort of in epistemological terms. It continues, I think, when you see the first sort of English Civil War ideas of why there should be free speech. You need free speech because you need to sort out false ideas from true ideas. I think you also see it in the leveller pamphlets from a Puritan point of view. When Puritans are really fighting against sort of high Anglicanism, one of their arguments is, we don't really know how to worship God yet. So we have to try out all these different worship practices in order to find the right one. They're not interested in individual freedom. They're interested in the freedom of God's will to find the individual. But it doesn't matter. In the secular world, it kind of all shuffles out in the same way. It's ultimately a history of doubt. What Harriet and John do is something I think quite remarkable, which is they believe in truth. They do believe that objective truth exists. But they say that it's possible for sort of your opponent to have slivers of truth, or even a large amount of truth in their argument. So it's not just, as Milton was saying in Agra Pagetica during the Civil War, that falsity and truth must clash. It's that actually there may well be truth in what your opponent says, a sliver or a large amount. And the only way to establish that is to have the discussion. Is to try and have the discussion, but have it in a very particular way. What they call for is a tremendous degree of confidence and humility. You have to have the confidence to face the very strongest version of the argument against you. What you'll see online nowadays, God, it makes me sound so old, the kids nowadays online, is people searching for the weakest argument against their position, the most extreme figure on the other side, and they'll take that and they'll put a retweet and go, aren't they all crazy and blah. It's so easy. Anyone can do it. Every political viewpoint has, lunatic adherents that you can grab hold of. It's much harder to find the most sophisticated, most powerful argument against your position and try to take that head on. Incidentally, that was what Karl Popper did, centuries later against Marxism. And I think Karl Popper did damage to Marxism from which it never recovered, not by taking it at its weakest, but by taking it its absolute strongest as a scientific theory, which should have predictive value, and in fact does not. The second was on humility, that you then have to be constantly thinking, and not just thinking, can I be wrong, but kind of wanting to be wrong, wanting to find something that may be an error in your position and that is held by your opponent. Now, anyone that follows me on Twitter will know that I'm not necessarily fantastic at this myself and can get quite worked up. And this is the way that these things go. But nevertheless, in your quieter moments, that's the manner in which you should be thinking. Now, one of the strongest arguments, I think, against Harriet and John is that they are asking for a degree of intellectual sort of consciousness that most people will never be able to attain. But the point isn't necessarily to attain it. The point is to have an ideal to aim towards in your own behavior, in your own intellectual life. And in that, I think that they are tremendously successful, and that is a very sensible manner of looking at what we should be trying to achieve.
I suppose really, when you think about it, children know what fairness is quite early on. You can have a good dialogue, a philosophical dialogue with children about what's fair for them and what's fair for their classmates, can't you? So you don't have to be a super philosopher like John Stuart Mill to be able to attain to this sort of reasoning. And most of us do it in the pub, don't we? we discuss what's right and what's fair.
Yeah, we do. I mean, we also, I think that's a really good analogy, I think, because when you see a group of friends arguing, either over quite sort of intense subjects, they're usually much more generous than the kind of arguments that you'll see on television or on social media or in sort of public forums, where you feel that you're representative, of a side and therefore cannot give any ground. In actual fact, that does us no good. I mean, Mill in particular reserved his fiercest sort of hatred for the disciples of a particular philosophical school who just ran at each other with knives and everything in order to prove the purity of their own position. All of that was completely rejected in the manner in which they wanted people to think. Their main thing was, it matters, and this is where the autonomy part comes in, that you have established it for yourself. If you have taken it as convention, then to them you are essentially worth nothing. You never did any thinking in the first place. And that sense of convention isn't just societal, it's also within the political groupings in which we find ourselves. And you find that a lot in the thinking that they had. I mean, John Stuart Mill's, I think his love for institutions, that came from conservatives. I think some of his historical views came from sort of quite conservative views of Carlyle. His love of poetry, which really saved his life before he met Harriet, came from something that the utilitarians thought, poetry was just a waste of time. That it was a fundamentally reactionary position, especially Wordsworth. They absolutely detested Wordsworth, which I kind of agree with them about, but whatever. I mean, it worked for John Stuart Mill, so fine. So, I mean, with all of this, they found that they themselves had been improved by taking on the ideas of others and trying to be humble in that way. So it is doable. And I do actually think quite often that the manner in which we discuss things with friends can often be a pretty good format for how we should be discussing things in the more formal sort of public world.
So if we argue as if we're arguing with friends, rather than be dead set against people as if they're our enemies, would be a better form of argument all round, wouldn't it?
Yes, maybe, although I don't want to question myself, but I do remember after Brexit, there was a lot of people who never saw their friends again. So there is a limit to how far this goes. But, certainly for the opening argument, that would be a pretty good manner in which to conduct.
Yeah. And these conflicting doctrines, instead of the one being true and the other false, you say, share the truth between them, what they say. And I think that's a really generous and proper way of looking at things, isn't it?
It's so much of liberalism is about acknowledging the defects of our own intellectual faculties. And that's there again from the very beginning with Descartes, where he says, how can I trust that what I see is what's real? When he was essentially toppling the Aristotelian structures that had existed until the Enlightenment, he was saying things like, well, actually, hang on, what if fire is the result of something that might be like atoms? What would we need if our eyes and our ears weren't the perfect guides to the objective world around us? What would you need? You would need hypotheses, and you would need instruments with which to test your hypotheses. And once you start having those things, you are engaged in an act of science. That's why liberalism and science were born at the same time, through the notion of doubt. That's essentially why reason and empirical reality have a very intimate relationship with liberalism that is not shared by any of the other philosophies, which are not grounded in that sense of doubt and of a recognition of our own weakness. And that really finds, one of its sort of perfect expressions, I think, in John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor. I should add, in reasons of fairness, that it also becomes a weapon against them, predominantly from Isaiah Berlin in the 20th century, who starts asking liberal questions and going, well, hang on a minute, you take the thing I said that was very radical about women's personality. Well, Isaiah Berlin says, well, hang on a minute, well, who are you to say that actually their personality is any different? The empirical behavior that we see is of a certain way. So therefore it follows that you're projecting your own certainties onto them and not respecting the real freedom of the individual to behave however they like. That's a complex, odd debate. But nevertheless, so doubt really continues after them in a way that sometimes weakens their position. In my opinion, it doesn't, but for some liberal philosophers, we would suggest that it does weaken their position. But they are one of the sort of key moments in that history of doubt that I think is at the absolute spine of the liberal story.
Yes. And they talk about higher pleasures and lower pleasures. And I think of it in the way that we think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, don't we? But they obviously have a kind of elitist views about what you should be thinking about and taking joy in, and the normal joys that most people take pleasure in.
Yeah, exactly. And look, this is from our modern perspective, some of the things that they say about higher and lower pleasures are very hard to take seriously. And they ultimately come to the conclusion, people should be free. And once people are free, they will want to do lots of different things. They will want to drink and eat and have sex, but also they're going to want to read liberal philosophy and, dedicate their life to books. And they say once they've tried the eating and the drinking and having sex, they'll decide that actually philosophy is more fun. Now, I think that's incorrect, objectively incorrect. And I say that as someone who spent the last 2 years reading philosophy in order to write this book. It is just not true. But more importantly, it speaks to a sort of trace element of conservative reluctance in their philosophy, which is, yes, they wanted everyone to be free to do whatever they want to do. But they kind of assumed once they did all the things they wanted to do, they would basically turn into people just like them. Now,
go on.
Just again, in the 20th century, you find that Isaiah Berlin is damning towards that kind of assessment. Isaiah Berlin would say, people are not just one kind of thing, even when they have freedom, that they want fundamentally different things, that they want things that conflict with one another, a sense of belonging versus a sense of freedom, a sense of faith versus a sense of sort of empiricism and openness, a sense of bravery versus a sense of being scholarly, a sense of charity versus a sense of self-interest. And that people and cultures have those different conflicting views, and that the importance of liberalism is not that we will all eventually turn out to be liberals. The importance of liberalism is that we are kind of this sounds patronizing, it probably is, the sort of primary school teachers. We establish the rules so that all these people who want different things are able to play well together without hurting one another, because there are no happy endings, because people will never just end up being exactly the same way. So you're right to point it out, because ultimately when you get to the higher lower pleasures bit, you think you get a sense that Harriet and John sort of look down at the full range of the freedom that they have just sort of legitimized and thought, oh, it's a bit much for their Victorian sensibilities. It's a minor failure.
Yeah, but I wondered whether they said that partly because of their own eccentric position. I won't put it in. Yes. Were they deflecting?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. There is, again, I don't want to go back to that syphilis theory. I mean, there is a tremendous amount of work out there, more than you would ever believe, about their sex life. You would not be the pages, and to consider for a moment the fact that there is no biography of Harriet Taylor. It's astonishing to me how much time people think they can dedicate to their sex life, predominantly on what kind of sex did they have. Did they have sex at all? You read their letters. I mean, you're just like, these people were obviously having sex. There's no need for us to be worrying about this any further than really at all in the first place. And so there's some people that say that their idea of the higher and lower pleasures was because they were somehow appalled by the human body and by biological functions. In fact, what they were was the use of biological functions to define what it is possible for an individual to be. And that was the feminist agenda. It was that essentially you cannot reduce women to the reproductive function through your laws and through your society. That was their horror at it. Anything else was just this sort of faintly Victorian idea of the fact that, ultimately our better part of ourselves is cerebral rather than sensual. And look, it's a little bit dated. I don't agree with it, but it's also, it's not a pivotal part of their thinking. It's absolutely not part of the central mechanism by which the philosophy operates. It is a kind of Victorian kind of detritus, really, that you can jettison or not. Some people may well agree with it.
Well, I think we want to go to questions, and I don't know that just bear with me. I don't know that we've actually had many questions apart from what was the book title, and actually somebody's answered that already. But I'm going to ask you a question that somebody asked me today. Is there an inherent tension between the individual freedom that they admire and they want us to develop and social progress?
Oh God, no, I don't believe that at all. I think it's through individual freedom. I mean, obviously I wouldn't. It's through individual freedom that we have secured universal progress. I think one of the things that happens now is that I think really predominantly because of Thatcher in this country and Reagan in the US, we associate the word individual with selfishness and neoliberalism. We can call it classical liberalism or laissez-faire or whatever.
Yes.
But that is not the heritage. In fact, that's not even the heritage in John Locke, in Adam Smith. Both of those thinkers thought, no, you have to take tax from people so that we can have public services, social services. There are many things the market cannot do. And John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor, but predominantly John Stuart Mill on economic questions, really changed that whole notion. So the question of the state versus the market does not admit of a universal solution. There are many things that in the name of individual freedom, the state must do to improve the lot of the majority in the population. For them, it was things like free education. It was things like an embryonic welfare state. Under Keynesianism, you see that writ large. You see the idea that by having funded public works, we experience something called the multiplier effect. You give one person a job. By doing it, someone has to come and set up a private company to provide, the sandwich store for which they can get their lunch when they're doing the public work. And that I benefit you. It is not simply a question, as Adam Smith said, that my private interest works out in the social interest. It is that the social interest also works out in the private interest. From that theory, from the idea of individual freedom interpreted in an egalitarian way, we saw the NHS, we saw the welfare state, we saw the European Union, we saw the WTO, international human rights law. These are examples of social progress, and they did not come from socialism. They did not come from conservatism. They came from liberalism, from a commitment to the freedom of the individual. That is their origin.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you. There's no two ways about it. We do have some questions now. And first of all, we have a question from Judith. She's happy for me to ask it for you. And then if David Barnsdale wants to stand by to ask his question when we get through this one. Judith says it's a fascinating presentation, which it has been. And she asks, particularly in the light of Harriet's understanding that women's subjugation, physically and legally, arises from the greater brute force of men from the beginning of society, what do you think she would make of modern woke feminism?
Well, I mean, I don't know what woke feminism means, and I don't like the word woke. I have to say this because I don't think it designates anything at the moment, except for a thing that we don't like, which liberals should be very sympathetic towards, because liberalism is typically used as something that other people don't like when it's used.
Yeah.
Certainly you would find, as you will with all sort of liberal theory, a commitment to the minority, making sure that the minority is protected against the prejudice and the discrimination of the majority. What you would also find is a commitment to freedom of speech and to not using convention as a way of bludgeoning people into silence on any particular issue. So I think when it comes to a variety of the issues that we see now, I think there would be deep concern from Harriet and John at the manner in which we debate and the way that we try to bully silence. But there would also be a sympathy and the pure heart of them on the side of minorities who face discrimination every day, be that on the basis of gender or sex or sexuality or race or any other category.
Okay, and I think that is purely liberalism. Judith, I have in mind in particular the denial of the relevance of biology as well as the silencing of debate. Is it possible to deny biology?
Well, I don't think that you're going to really struggle to come. This is the thing that I don't like that people do. They take someone that they like. They're asked, what would Orwell think about the EU? And what they would invariably do is say, well, he would think exactly what I think about the world. I don't think that's clear remotely from what they said. I mean, when you look at their work, they're not operating in a place where gender and biology are separate categories in the manner in which they think and talk. I think that's implicit in it. But ultimately, in that debate, you would be hard pressed to see how debates around sort of trans issues are expressed by them in that work. It's just not there. I would go back to what I said originally. Their heart would be with minorities who face discrimination. Their commitment would be with debate that is freely held, where people are not silenced. And I think in this debate, I'm doing it myself because that is predictably what my position is in this matter. But nevertheless, I suspect that's where they come down to.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable, actually. That we do have a duty, don't we, to protect people who are the underdog, and that's typically the sort of thing we cheer for the team that's not doing so well, don't we? Even if they're not our first thought. David Barnsdale, do you want to ask your question? Bear in mind what Ian's replied already.
Okay. Well, today I got a reply from Federal Conference Committee. It was excluding an amendment that some of us had moved, and that in itself wasn't a surprise. It was the fact that they picked up on an argument that we'd put in the amendment, which was pretty much lifted from on liberty, and that is that anybody who is trying to censor another opinion is essentially taking on the mantle of infallibility. And they actually used the very argument that Harriet and John used in, which placed in on liberty as a kind of devil's advocate position, and then rebutted. So my question is, if a time machine could bring Harriet to today and she joined the Liberal Democrats, how would she fare?
I'm essentially going to sidestep this by saying something flippant. Neither of them would fare very well in any political party. John Stuart Mill was in the Liberal Party. And when they came to him to say, will you stand as an MP? He said, I'll stand as an MP as long as you can never tell me what to do. I'll come to my own conclusions on anything. And I refuse to accept the authority of the party over any of my thoughts. And it made him predictably unpopular, not least because some of his opinions were actually, I think, quite dreadful. I mean, he was against the secret ballot. He was for, capital punishment. And he didn't do well in the party. And Harriet would have faced exactly the same problem. They weren't really joiners in any conventional sense. And I think that they would have had that hit them quite badly as a member of a political party. So I kind of get that I'm not answering the meat of the question that you're going for there. I think I've sort of answered that in the previous question. But as members of a political party, they would not have succeeded.
That's a very diplomatic way of answering. Can I call on Sam to ask your question about an overlap with Stoicism? Sam? And then Fawcett Habers after you.
Yes, can you hear me, Ian?
Yeah, fire away.
Excellent. I was just interested in what you thought about this overlap that might be there with Stoicism and their sort of they have a similar sort of view on what is of value, not being physical pleasure and more philosophical pursuits, and not doing harm, not considering harm to yourself if it really doesn't hurt you, that sort of thing.
I wish I had the knowledge to speak authoritatively about Stoicism, and I absolutely do not in any way. Certainly that idea of higher and lower pleasures goes way, way, way back. I mean, certainly with the Greeks, and you find out. So, I mean, this is not something they come up with. And obviously it was still there in the Victorian times. I think it's probably there really until the 60s. That comes from that liberal revolution in the 60s, which is also, as well as what we see with race and everything else, it's also really that we see it on the basis of lifestyle. And now we see a process with that, which extends into even, the coming up with hierarchies of cultural value, for instance, is a regrettable sort of facet of a previous time. Something which I'm very sympathetic towards, but then, I am the age that I am from my age. Maybe that's a convention I should fight more against. But certainly they have that in them, absolutely. And you could track it to harm. I mean, I did consider for a bit, whether to try and put the Greeks into the ancient Greeks, that is, into this book. And I just sort of thought, A, you're going to lose a lot of readers if you start there. And B, I did talk to sort of some scholars in this area about the concept of the individual, and they went, really, it's not really there. I mean, you get it in certain aspects, certain flickers, but you really have to do a kind of really radical interpretation of what's being said to find the individual in ancient Greek. So I think it's not only a sensible marketing and commercial decision to start with the Enlightenment, but also happens to be objectively true.
Okay, is that okay, Sam?
Yeah, great, thanks.
Fawcett, you have a question about human cruelty.
Yes, I do. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So I was interested in saying before that, the main principle for liberalism is do no harm when it comes to, freeing yourself to essentially be able to do what you want. But I mean, does he agree that there have been moments where Victorian liberalism has led to certain aspects of human cruelty being displayed in its wildest forms? So, for example, the contempt for tradition, led to, I wouldn't say led to slavery, but it certainly justified slavery by being able to scientifically, racially strata people and say, oh, well, this person's black, so we can treat them X, Y, Z. And that came from a form of rationalist liberalism, as it were. Would he necessarily agree with that?
Yeah, but not quite for those reasons. So, I mean, firstly, I should clarify, it's not do no harm. It's more that harm is the only basis upon which you can legitimately interfere with someone else's freedom. And of course, people will come up with different interpretations of what that entails. Is it the smoking ban? Does that mean you get to interfere because, you might cause cancer, sort of passive smoking? This kind of, it's a complicated arrangement. So I don't think it's on that basis. I do think that liberal theory was often used by imperialists to justify what they were doing. So for instance, Locke, who is a really important thinker, he's much more interesting than he's made out to be, and he's much more radical than he's made out to be. He has a theory of how property comes into existence. His theory is basically, you mix your labor with something. Once you mix your labor, if you, even picking an apple off a tree, but certainly, planting seeds of apple trees, that then makes it your property. And that's a very bad theory. But it was central for a long time to sort of liberal economic thought. And that was certainly utilized against indigenous populations to say, well, only Western sort of methods of cultivation count as property. And therefore we can just take all of this land. And that absolutely was used. I guess some of my, actually, let me go a little bit further with that. There was, for a tremendously long time in liberalism, really up until Harriet and John, and then I think another weakness up until the 1960s, a failure of imagination when it came to the idea of individual freedom. And that was, it's very easy to imagine the freedoms that you're affected by, right? And so when it's heterosexual, middle-class, white men, the kind of freedoms they came up with were free speech and, votes. They didn't think about things like workplace harassment. How does workplace harassment stop them from advancing? And how does that prevent them? How does racial discrimination act to control someone's freedom, to limit the opportunities that they have? What is required when you look at individual freedom is an act of imagination and also of listening to people's experiences so that you can uncover the kinds of limitations on freedom that you might not come up with in your own imagination. Now, I think their establishment of feminism, in these 1800s was the first stage of that, but the big stage really came in the 1960s, and it came because of the expansion of the franchise, I think, of insisting on that. And so it was a sort of element of standpoint theory into liberal thought that was really behind many of the advances that we saw in the 1960s. And even today, we see a limitation in people's imaginative capacity when it comes to these issues. Sorry, that was quite a laborious and long answer. Was it remotely?
No, it's fine. I probably might kind of follow up to it, or might probably take you to another laborious answer. No, not laborious. I don't think it was laborious at all. But I think follow up was to say, in some ways, do you see that same sort of contempt for tradition in, I guess, trans activist arguments for trying to deconstruct or undermine the female body or the material reality of a female body? Do you see that? Do you see parallels with that?
No, I don't. I suspect that my views on this issue would not be similar to the ones of many people listening to me right now.
Yes,
but my really firm view is that we're dealing with categories. Let me put it this way. You cannot describe a marginalized category unless you have the words to describe the way in which it is oppressed. So it's a problem whenever we get to a situation where you can't use words like women. That is a huge problem.
Right.
However, most of that debate, as far as I understand it, and my experience of it is limited, is about people talking about categories that for the individual will be very difficult. And sometimes it will be sexuality, and sometimes it will be gender, and sometimes it will be sex itself. And the liberal view is to try and find human flourishing, human freedom for each individual, regardless of the social restrictions that are put across them. Now, that is a delicate, complicated debate. So the key thing, and I presume what the view would be of Harriet and John, but then of course I would say that because that happens to be my view, is that it would be the incumbent to do it in the most generous way on both sides, of trying not to find a way of hammering the other and silencing the other, but actually to say, what is the kind of forum, what is the kind of basis of discussion upon which people can have that debate, can work their way through it for an individual and a political level. And that I think that will mostly come from liberal principles, that might be possible. And at the moment, I know it doesn't seem like it is possible, that, from someone who had like a walk-on role in the Brexit debate, which was not a very friendly debate. I've got to say, we look on some of these issues from afar and go, that looks horrible, so I get that it's not where it is. But that does seem to me to be, if there is an answer to these questions, it's not by one group winning or one group being silenced or not. It comes from coming up with the kind of forum and the kind of manner in which those debating those very complex, delicate ideas can be fully expressed by everyone.
I guess maybe the answer, well, not the answer, because this is a forum, right? And no one has the answer. But the line of thought would be, and when I think about EU law, ECHR, that the principle of rights, when it engages another person's rights, it becomes something to think about. And that's where I always say this: you have the right to, wave your arms freely, but it stops at the moment where it hits my face. And that's where that tension or that conflict sort of arises, right? Between this form of course, be liberal and, of course, do what you want, but where it engages with the rights of others, whether it's, sex, whether it's sexual orientation, that's where there's a tension, and that needs to be, the limits of that liberalism kind of needs to be looked at, maybe, or considered more thoroughly. I guess what I'm trying to say is, where can we fully have liberalism free from the counterweight of experience, scientific method, common sense?
Well, you see,
that was my last thing, by the way. I'm not going to hog.
Okay, no, great. Let me quickly go on it. So, contested rights is kind of the bread and butter of liberalism. You know, it's really hard that you find one set of rights has no influence on someone else. Usually it does. So for instance, you know, we've spent the last 18 months, a lot of us, losing our right to leave our homes, you know. And that loss of rights came because we were trying to protect the right to, you know, to be healthy, to not suffer unnecessary death. So we deal with contested rights all the time. You know, the question is, and often that involves difficult answers.
Yeah.
What liberalism asks is we do it case by case, and we do not try to deny that there are sacrifices that are required, that we try to work on the basis of individual freedom in order to establish the right course of action. Now, it's not a very satisfying view. And throughout history, one of liberalism's greatest weaknesses is it's not very good at sort of man the barricades. Here's a simple answer and then everything's going to be okay, because it isn't. That's not how it works. But it does offer the chance for progress that probably leaves everyone a little bit disappointed, but that does actually get us further and secure the various conflicting rights that people have in society.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
No, thank you.
We've got time probably for one, maybe two questions yet. And NB's asked me to ask you, how does liberalism, and particularly J.S. Mill, discuss the issues of class within society that require resolving?
Yeah, it's interesting. Actually, you know what's weird is on class, it's actually Harriet that has the greater contribution to the political economy. And she essentially added a chapter, which is basically written in her own hand, on what's called The Future of the Labouring Classes. And it was an attempt to try and find a middle ground between capitalism and communism. It's through workers' cooperatives. I mean, essentially what we call it right now is the John Lewis model. And it's a sort of passable, you know, it's an idea that never goes away. It's constantly sort of brought up, and it's a pretty good one. It's useful contribution. The reason that I think it sort of pales is because John Stuart Mill, who's less concerned with the notion of class to a certain extent, starts exploring something else, which is really the point at which the state can interfere in economic affairs. And his answer is, there is really nothing that you can say that the state cannot do. And there is nothing you can say that the market cannot do. He says we need a case-by-case basis assessment of this, particularly with natural monopolies, but that ultimately, you know, you should have a mixed economy. What he's looking for is the kind of economy that we established after the Second World War, and that I think we lost with the rise of neoliberalism in the mid-70s, and especially the late 70s. So that's their answer. What's interesting, though, is that John Stuart Mill's envisaged society is tremendously egalitarian. He hates what was called then the leisured classes. He especially hates getting money through rent. He constantly uses this phrase. He says their money falls into their mouth as they sleep, which he just finds completely objectionable. He says there should be no class which isn't working, and there should be no class which isn't able to enjoy leisure. He, on property, said, you know, that we should be limited to having a small property and a small garden, and that's it. You know, you shouldn't be able to have these huge, vast tracts of land, being able to own all of this. No, he was looking at a very, very equal society. He didn't really talk the language of class apart from when, you know, attacking the so-called leisured class. It was much more Harriet that would use that kind of language. But I do think that when you look at what he was providing essentially that post-war consensus that did us tremendously well for 30 years. And where, you know, in my opinion, the moment that we gave up on it as liberals and was seduced by sort of Hayek's laissez-faire neoliberal sort of ideas, did us a tremendous disservice and did huge damage to liberalism and to the world at large.
Okay, I think, is that all right, NB? Any problem with that? I don't think so. Right, one last question. Tom Woolmore wants to know, with the term liberal often being used to describe those on the left or to deride those with socially liberal views, particularly by right-wing media outlets, where do you believe the dividing line now lies between the modern liberal and the modern left in Britain, other than all the arguments on Twitter?
Well, you see, this is like what I find tremendously frustrating, you know, through the Corbyn period, and of course it's sort of continuing now, is when you get down onto policy, you think, well, for left-wing liberalism, for social democratic sort of liberalism, for egalitarian liberalism, what exactly is a distinction? You know, if the proposal is full communism, liberalism is going to have a problem with that, okay? Because the basis is You're not going to be able to decide a way of giving the state all the power over economic life. There are questions you're going to have to answer about, for instance, what if I want to set up a t-shirt company tomorrow? Am I allowed to do that? When you say that, to those who can provide, to those who needs, a nice view from their house. And if nobody needs that, how are you going to prevent that just going to people who are connected to the central party? All of the fundamental questions that liberalism asked of communism, that it warned about with communism, and that when immediately came to pass on conformity, on powers for the state, and on the eventual process of trying to annihilate populations who objected to it, they were proved to be correct. But I don't hear people really expressing, even on sort of the Corbynite left, for communism. What I hear them talking about is having a healthy public sector with a private sector, which seems to me to be what radical liberalism is. I can't see the distinction. All the distinction really comes down to is this sort of sense of, will you worship our hero? Which in this case was Corbyn, and would be a different leader for someone else. And I just find that completely shocking. Liberalism does not worship leaders. It provides support where it thinks they deserve it. It retracts that support where it thinks they do not. It supports them on a case-by-case basis. It is against hero worship. And the moment that you see hero worship start to come over people, the moment that you see them start to change their assessment of objective reality by virtue of whether it's useful to their support to the leader, that's when the warning lights go on in liberalism and say, no, we've got a problem here. You're doing something rather dangerous. And that, I suggest, is kind of an object lesson in what's happened to us. So on policy terms, there should be much more cooperation than there is. The fact that there isn't, I think, is a pretty damning assessment of the level of hero worship that took over the British left over the last few years. Something which, incidentally, you are not seeing in the US with the Bernie Sanders supporters, and who are able to work much, much better with those elements of sort of the liberal left and to win elections and to improve the country for the population at large. So it may or may not, be something that we may wish to emulate in this country.
Yeah, I think that's really great. With one last comment from Helen about something in the magazines last week. In The Economist, classic liberals conceded that your freedom to swing your fist stops where my nose begins. Today's progressives argue that your freedom to express your opinions stop where my feelings begin. Contested again. Look, I'd like to thank you really, really very much for all these questions, and thanks to all of you for joining us in this conversation. I think you've given us a really thought-provoking evening for a fascinating introduction to the life and work of Harriet Taylor Mill. You've given a voice to a liberal woman, essentially, and the gripping history of liberalism in your book, How to Be a Liberal.